Let's take a look at price controls. Let's start with a maximum price in particular, also known as a price ceiling. This is used when price equilibrium is considered too high for consumers. So I'll give you two examples here. One is the equilibrium price for a gallon of gas being $10, or another one is the equilibrium price for 1 month's rent being $1,000. Let's just say that the citizens in this area are complaining they think that those prices are too high. Again, those are the equilibrium prices. Those are the market clearing prices where demand and supply meet. So that's the natural free market price. But the citizens make it known to their government that those prices are not sustainable to them. The citizens can't afford those prices. So the government comes in and sets a law that limits the prices and prevents them from going to where the free market wants those prices to be. Let's use the example of that fixed income rent. So here we have $1,000 rent. That's the natural price for rent in this fictional city for a one-bedroom apartment. And the citizens complain, they tell their elected representatives, we can't afford $1,000 a month and survive. So the government decides to pass a law. And they set a max price law. See, I label a line called max price. And they come up with a max price. I'm putting a number here, $800, to help visualize the concept. But you don't need to put numbers here. You can always explain the theory just by using PE and Pmax on the y-axis. I'm just explaining it with numbers. So the government says $800 a month. That's much more practical, but that's going to cause a problem. You see the wedge here, correct? That wedge is excess demand. If the government sets the price lower than the natural free market price of PE, and the government comes in and says $800 is the maximum price that you could charge for rent, well, consumers are going to want more housing than if the price was at $1,000 a month. While producers, the people who provide the rentals, they're not going to want to provide as much rentals at only $800 a month. It might not be worth it. So we have excess demand. Now, that excess demand cannot be allowed. It leads to, for one thing, unfair rationing. If there's excess demand, it means there's a shortage. And if there's a shortage, and there's a maximum price in this case of $800, well, how do you determine who's going to get the housing if there isn't enough housing to go around? Usually it would be price. Usually, if you could afford it, you get it. If you can't afford it, you don't get it. But if you're going to artificially lower price, then there's going to be more people who can afford it than there are houses or rentals available. So how do you give it out? It's going to be unfair systems. It'll just be random luck whether or not you get into a house or not. Maybe you get placed on a wait list. You could be on that wait list for a long time. Is that really fair if you could otherwise pay for it even if the price was a little higher? The other problem is a black market. People might be selling housing. They might be making off-the-books deals that they'll rent for $850 a month, and people are desperate, so they'll pay for it. But you're not allowed to do that. I mean, that defeats the purpose of the max price law. So you're going to have to hire police, and that's going to be costly. So you can't have the excess demand because of those two reasons. So you have three options, really. The first is to have the government subsidize the firms or the producers. So in this case, the government can provide subsidies to companies that provide rentals. Alternatively, the government could provide the rentals themselves. Both of those will be showed diagrammatically by shifting supply to the right. And by doing that, their government's creating a new equilibrium here, where the price is $800 a month, and they'll produce this much housing instead, getting rid of the excess by shifting supply to the right. But both of those options are very costly for the government to put money into the supply side of these markets. So another option for the government is to advertise to encourage limited use. Maybe tell people that they should be, in this case, a little more, look for ways that you can legally rent with another family member, for example. And it doesn't really work great with this example. Maybe an example like the gasoline example makes more sense. Limit your gas usage. That would keep prices down. But the problem with advertising is it's costly, it's risky, and most importantly, it undermines the goal. Like, look here. I'm sorry, I'm all over the place here. If we advertise and we shift demand to the left through advertising, you'll notice that originally consumption was at QE at the $1,000 price level. Once we advertise and shift demand back, now less people are going to have the affordable housing. The original goal in the first place was to get more people into cheap housing. So again, your options are for the government to subsidize producers of rentals, for the government to provide rentals directly, or to advertise to reduce the usage of whatever the good is, in this case rentals. But all of those come with their problems. So we have to evaluate, is it a good idea to use a maximum price? Well, you're helping consumers, but in order to make this system work, it's costly. Again, I point you to costly, costly, costly under each of the three options available to the government. So an alternative is to allow the price to remain too high. The feeling is eventually some consumers will change habits. So in the case of this rental situation, some people will eventually move, perhaps, or maybe they will move in with other family members. That will lead demand to naturally decrease, and PE will naturally decrease as demand decreases. So pretty much what you see here, demand decreasing, which was caused by the advertising, if you leave the market alone long enough, that demand will naturally shift to the left and bring prices down with it. And so those people who stay in the market will enjoy the lower prices. But the problem with that is the only reason the prices went down is because some consumers left the market in the first place. And when we're talking about a good like rentals, or we're talking about a good like gasoline, those are necessities. And if the government can do something to keep that product in people's hands, maybe they're obligated to do it. Isn't that a government's role? So if a product is a necessity, for one thing, the demand may not decrease because people don't have too many options when it comes to items like rentals or gasoline. But for another thing, it's kind of unfair to hope that people will stop demanding these products. So the conclusion is maximum price is appropriate when we have a necessity. So the examples of gasoline and rentals are great examples of when a maximum price is effective and relevant. But it's not always so clear-cut. For example, how do we determine if $800 is a fair rental price? Yes, rentals are a necessity, but do we have to guarantee that everyone can afford them on every income? So not only is there a decision about should we use a maximum price, but what should that maximum price be? And that's where these get very tricky, because governments know that when they set max prices, they're going to get excess demand, and when there's excess demand, they have to do other things to eliminate that excess demand or deal with untenable problems that would disrupt the whole system. So, costly system, but when you're dealing with a necessity, you really need to consider it for your citizens. Let's look at a minimum price, or a price floor. This is used when PE is considered to be too low. So an example is the equilibrium price for an apple is 5 cents an apple. The government says, no, that's not fair for producers if, even though they understand again that in this case 5 cents is the market clearing price. That's the price that apples are supposed to be in the free market in any given year. Let's say in 2015 that was the equilibrium price for apples, the free market price. The government says that's too low. The producers are complaining to us, and they have a good point. They can't possibly make it happen on only 5 cents an apple. So the government sets a law that will raise prices. So here we have equilibrium for apples before the minimum price, 5 cents an apple. And the government says, let's guarantee 15 cents an apple. Again, I'm putting numbers here to help you visualize the concept. Here are the numbers. But you can simply go with PE and PMIN on the y-axis, and then you draw a line and label it minimum price. Make sure you label it PMIN on the y-axis because the y-axis is your price axis, and then you label the line itself the minimum price line. Now, just like max price, there's a problem, but instead of there being excess demand, now there's excess supply. If you're guaranteeing apple farmers more money for their apples, they're going to be even more eager to produce the apples, while consumers are not going to be as willing to consume the apples as they were at the lower price, right? So at 5 cents, that was the market clearing price. Maybe, for example, consumers demanded 15 bushels of apple in this one store each day, and suppliers were willing to supply 15 bushels of apple of this one product each day. But at 15 cents, producers are like, great, we'll provide 30 bushels of apples a day. But consumers don't demand that much at all. They're only demanding a few apples a day because they're not going to pay 15 cents. So there's excess supply. Excess supply cannot be allowed. Some producers will cheat the max price, which means they will go out of their way to sell their product at a lower price. So follow this. the initial price was 5 cents. The government comes in and says, no, let's make it 15 cents an apple. And then some farmers are going to still go out and sell their apples for maybe 5 cents an apple. You're saying, why would they do that? The government just set a law to protect them. Well, if there's excess supply, that means there were leftover apples, and some farmers aren't willing to risk being the farmer who gets stuck with the leftovers. So they'll go out and illegally sell their product at a lower price just to make sure they're not the ones who are stuck with the excess. Another problem is producers lose the incentive to be efficient. If you're an apple farmer and you're guaranteed 15 cents an apple when just last year you were only making 5 cents an apple, now you're not encouraged to be efficient and get every single apple off the tree. You can allow for some waste because you're making more money per product, per apple. So what are the options that the government has to eliminate the excess supply? First, the government can pay producers not to produce. They could tell half the apple farmers, we'll pay you up front $1,000 if you don't use your farmland. That's very costly, not to mention, imagine when people find out about this, that farmers are getting paid not to work. Another example is the government can purchase the items directly from the producers. Now that doesn't sound as bad as we had just said, paying people not to produce, but there's still problems here. Once the government purchases those apples, they can't go ahead and sell them, because if they do, then those items go back onto the market and it defeats the purpose. So if the market buys up the apples to take them off the market, they can't put them back on the market. They either have to hold the apples, which they could freeze them, but they won't last forever, or they could try selling them overseas, but that's even more costly. A final option is to advertise to encourage consumption, so the government can have a huge campaign to have people buy more apples. But as always, the problem with advertising is it's costly and it's not guaranteed to have an effect. And especially because we're usually talking about farm goods when it comes to maximum prices, I don't think you'd really have a successful advertising campaign that would really get people to severely increase their consumption of apples. So back to this example here, this diagram shows what would happen if the government would pay producers not to produce, or if they purchase directly from producers. Those first two options, there they are again, they both would result in the supply shifting to the left, which would create a new equilibrium where demand and supply one meet at 15 cents an apple. Yes, there'd be less apples consumed, but they'd be produced at a higher, or being sold at a higher price. The other option for the government is to advertise to promote apple consumption. That would raise the price of apples, but again, we talked about the cost and risk associated with that. So let's talk about whether or not a minimum price is appropriate. For one thing, the minimum price does protect producers, but again, it's costly to maintain, as we just discussed. So the alternative is to just allow the price to remain too low. And it looks very similar to when we just were talking about maximum prices. In this case, some producers will produce different products. So in the apple example, some producers may decide to produce peaches now. The supply of the apples will decrease. Supply will naturally shift left. And if you look at a basic equilibrium diagram, when you shift supply to the left, PE will increase. So the remaining producers, the producers who don't quit, they will enjoy higher prices. So those producers who stayed in the apple market will now be able to sell apples at higher prices. And so if you leave the free market alone, once some producers quit the market, that will drive prices higher. But the problem is then the market becomes vulnerable. So if you have half your apple producers leave, and now you have half as many apple producers the next year because you let the free market do its thing, and then some blight comes in and affects half of the remaining apple producers, you're down to 25% output compared to what you had before you even tried the minimum price, before you consider the minimum price. So the market becomes vulnerable. Sometimes you don't want producers to give up on a market. So again, the conclusion is a minimum price is also appropriate for necessities. But the question is, when is it a necessity? And so in this example, maybe apples are a very essential food in this economy, and the government says we can't leave our apple farmers out there without help, because if we do, some of them will leave, and we don't want to become vulnerable. We don't want to have too few apple producers in case a crisis negatively impacts the supply of apples. So those are two examples of maximum and minimum prices. and good examples of when those things should be considered, as well as evaluations. Be sure that you can evaluate both of them and explain when a max price and a minimum price is appropriate and when the government may decide it's not worth pursuing those options.